Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering a little bit of history of three of Wallsend's public houses. This will be part of a series of videos about the many pubs of Wallsend, but for the moment I will only be covering those still standing, and I will try and cover the lost pubs of Wallsend at a later date. Public houses are often old and interesting looking buildings, but they don't always have the same available information about them as other buildings, such as Wallsend Town Hall for example. It's quite rare to find details of any opening events, and most of the information would simply be who was manager when, and that really isn't enough detail to make a video about each one of them on its own. So putting a few together I hope will be a little bit more interesting. This is just going to be a basic history about each pub and a few little interesting, hopefully, news articles about things that happened in them or things connected to them in the past. Obviously some pubs will have a little bit more about them than others. I hope that you will enjoy this first pub video and the others that follow at a later date. The first pub that I am starting with is the New Winning. While researching this, I found it named as the New Winning Tavern, Inn and Hotel, but I will stick with just calling it the New Winning for the purpose of this video. The New Winning is the last pub on the High Street. I have actually seen it described as being on Church Bank, but it is stated that it is the last building on the High Street before the name changes to Church Bank. Of course, if you are coming up from Church Bank, it will then be the first pub on the High Street. The pub was probably built in around 1871, and certainly by 1873 Mr. Joseph Beale was the innkeeper, as they were known in those days, or sometimes beer house keepers, and he lived there with his wife Isabella and his young family. When Mr. Beale first ran the New Winning, it would have been a lot smaller than it is today. It was rebuilt, or rather extended, in 1894, and the newer part, the part facing onto the High Street, was joined onto the older part, which is now at the back of the pub. A lot of local pubs on the High Street and other areas too started life as much smaller buildings, but as the town grew they became too small for all the new customers, and many were extended or completely rebuilt, and some often added bedrooms to them. This was probably because many people were coming to the town to work, but they did not have anywhere to live, and this would give extra income to the beer house keepers. I understand that the pub was named after the sinking of the G pit and the winning of its first coals. The pub is also situated over the top of some of the tunnels that were used when G pit was in use. In 1873 a bad storm hit the northeast and lightning struck the roof of the New Winning. Sadly, this caused a lot of damage to the roof, which also resulted in some of the slates ending up inside the building in the bedroom where Mr. Beale's young children were sleeping, and tragically one of Mr. Beale's young sons was killed when he was hit on the head by one of the slates. Joseph Beale died in 1880 in August, and he was succeeded by his wife Isabella and then later his son William. Joseph left an estate of around £2,000 at the time of his death. William, who had been born in the New Winning, was only 36 years old when he died in 1896 after a long illness. It would seem that he was the last of the Beale family to run the pub. Like a lot of public houses, the New Winning was often used for inquest hearings, such as the one for Richard Lumley, who had died while working at the Turk's Head in Willington Quay in 1891, and also that of John Sisterton, who died in 1898 while working on the Seven Arches Bridge. His was a story that I had never heard before. He had been working to replace the wooden timbers with iron girders, and while on the top of the bridge, the crane he had been using to lift the girders into place toppled over the bridge while he was still inside it. A passerby had actually been looking up at the time and saw the whole thing happen, something that you would never forget for the rest of your life. In later years, the pub became less popular and it eventually closed for good in probably around 2013. I have to admit that it wasn't a pub that I really went to. It was a little bit too far to walk, and I think at most I went in there about twice. But I'm sure that many Wallsenders will remember going there for great nights out. The new inn stood empty for several years until planning was finally passed for it to be converted into flats. Although it is no longer a pub, it's nice to see the old building still there and still being used. It's not listed as in Grade 2 or Grade 1, but it is on what's known as the local register, which means it is seen as being an important historical building. The next pub that I am looking at is the Coach and Horses. Just like the new Winning, this one was once a very much smaller pub. In fact, compared to today's pub, the old one was tiny. The original pub had been here since the late 1700s, surrounded by fields. You may remember mention of the Coach and Horses field in the town hall story. One of the first known licensees was Joseph Atkinson in 1858, although obviously there would have been many more before him. In early 1900, plans were in place to rebuild the old Coach and Horses and make it a much larger and also turn it into a hotel. At the time, the pub was owned by W.B. Reid and Company Limited of Newcastle, and the beer housekeeper was William Thompson, and it was William who applied for the rebuilding of the pub. The new pub was designed by the company architects of W.B. Reid, named only as Watson. When first built, it was a very impressive looking building, probably something that would have stood out on the high street for anyone passing by, as at the time there was nothing of the same size in that area. And at the time it was built, it had a central tower on the roof, resembling a school bell tower. I have not been able to find anything out about what this was, but it was obviously removed in later years, as it is not there today, but there are no details of when or why it was removed. The new pub opened in around 1903. However, by February of 1904, Superintendent Hay at the licensing session drew attention to the fact that the building had 8 bedrooms on the plans. However, when he had visited, only 4 had been furnished, and these were being used by the staff and management, and the other 4 had not been touched as per the license agreement. It was stated that the owners had been told the license would not be renewed for the pub unless these bedrooms were furnished for use. This, he was happy to report, had been done, and the license was renewed. It was almost a case of the new Coach and Horses being closed before it had opened. In 1912, the manager of the Coach and Horses was Mr. Ray, and in July of that year a fire broke out in the pub, trapping him and his wife and child in the staff living area on the second floor. They had a very lucky escape, as their exit was blocked by the fire, and they were eventually rescued by the fire brigade, but not before Mr. Ray had to hold his child out of one of the windows to keep them safe from the smoke. It was said that the damage to the pub was quite considerable. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a follow-up article to say how long it was before the pub was able to reopen. I didn't often go to the Coach, as we called it, when I lived in the centre of Wallsend, but when I lived closer to it, it became my local for a while, and I do remember having some good nights in there in the mid-90s, and I'm sure that many other people of Wallsend remember going there too. The Coach and Horses is a Grade 2 listed building. It was listed in February of 1986. The exterior of the pub is quite decorative, with a lot more detail to it than you might notice at first glance. In later years, the Coach and Horses struggled, sometimes open and sometimes closed, until it eventually closed for good in 2017. Since then, it has unfortunately stood empty. The lease for part of the building was on offer recently, but at the time it stated that the building can no longer be used as a public house, though no clear reason is given for this, and that reason is open to speculation. Unfortunately, the lease does not seem to have been taken by anyone, and we can only hope that something good happens to the former Coach and Horses very soon. The next pub I am covering is the Queen's Head, one of the older pubs on Wallsend High Street, and probably the only pub which remains about the same size today as it was when it was first built, and this one is still in use as a public house. The Queen's Head was on the High Street sometime before 1865, but no exact date of when it was built seems to be known. In charge of the pub in 1867 was Mr. William Dodds, and by 1872 he was also the owner of the Queen's Head, so business must have been quite good. In 1867 the pub was where the Wallsend local board went for a meal after their main meeting, which had been held in the Zion, one of those, chapel earlier that day. It was said that they enjoyed some very good food and later enjoyed a good old sing-song. They did do a little more work, but it sounds like several toasts later and it had turned into a bit more of a party than a meeting. In 1877, Elijah Moorman, the beer house keeper of the Queen's Head, was summoned to court for trying to bribe a policeman after he'd been caught keeping the pub open during prohibited hours. During the 1800s, the licensing laws had begun to restrict the opening hours of public houses, no doubt in an attempt to stop people drinking at all hours of the day. One of the charges against Elijah was dismissed, but he was fined 40 shillings and costs for his bribery attempt. It would also seem that Elijah was not the licensee, that was actually his wife Elizabeth, so this may have been the reason why the first charge against him was dismissed. The Queen's was often used as a place to hold meetings. One Friday in 1894, the Tyne shipyard apprentice riveters who were on strike at the time held one of their meetings there. I doubt that Mr. Hunter would have been too happy about this choice of meeting place, as he was not a fan of the so-called demon drink, and would not have approved of his workers going there en masse. But in most cases it was simply just down to the fact that pubs were larger and able to hold more people. Whether the strike issue was resolved or not I do not actually know, but they were planning to go back the next day for another meeting. The Queen's Head, as I said earlier, is still open today and still trading under the same name. To the best of my knowledge, I don't believe it has ever changed its name. I didn't go into the Queen's much in my younger days, but have been in more recent times, and I am sure many Wallsenders listening will have had some good nights out in the Queen's Head. I do hope that you have enjoyed this short video. As said before, it's not a full history of any of the pubs, just a few interesting little tales from the past. I thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.